it crossed my mind at some point that this might be the worst Stormlight Archive book. Hey guys, welcome to another video. My name is Ian. Welcome back to the channel Ian the Reader. Today, I am going to attempt to do a spoiler-free review of Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson. I say attempt because I'm going to keep it spoiler-free, but reviewing a book like this is nearly impossible in my opinion because one, it's humongous. So how can I possibly in one video cover all of the things that I thought about this video? But two, it's the 5th book in a series, so I'm going to, like I said, keep this spoiler-free, and overall, my attempt with this video is to let you know whether or not I think Brandon Sanderson nails this sort of finale to the Stormlight Archive, and whether or not you, if you've never read any of his books, should endeavor upon the thousands and thousands of page journey that is the Stormlight Archive to read this book. If you don't know anything about the Stormlight Archive, this is the fantasy author Brandon Sanderson's magnum opus, the large, huge, future 10-book series that is the culmination of his overall multiverse that is the Cosmere. That includes books like Mistborn and Elantris and Warbreaker, wow. Yeah, so there's a lot of books that go into this, and this is really the heart and soul of the Cosmere. This book is really interesting as well because it is a sort of finale in that, like I said, this is going to be a 10-book series, but this is book 5 and it is the end of the first arc of the Stormlight Archive. I didn't really know what all that would entail going in, and I have some thoughts on that we'll get to in a little bit. But before we jump in, I would appreciate it if you would like and subscribe if you haven't already. I post videos 2 to 3 times a week, talk about all sorts of genres, and I would love it if you stuck around. To be honest, this book was very different than the rest of the Stormlight Archive. I'm gonna spoil a couple things as far as like story structure and which characters are at play here that I want to talk about, but I'm not going to tell you any plot details specifically or where any of our characters end up or anything like that. So this book is different because in the past, the Stormlight Archive books would be split into typically 5 parts, and each of those would kind of build in tension, kind of rise and fall, and there were a lot of different POVs that were kind of focused in specific areas. With this book, instead, due to the things that happened at the end of book 4, the entire structure of the story takes place pretty much in 10 days, the 10 days leading up to this final confrontation between good and evil. That was a structure that I was a little bit trepidatious about coming in because one of the things that I love about Stormlight Archive is the way that we kind of bounce back and forth but are very focused in each section on which characters we follow. Because of the structure of the story, we have to follow a lot of different characters in each day because they're all kind of on their own journeys throughout the story, and we can't miss pivotal moments with them because it all has to take place chronologically, if that makes sense. Things can't really take place at the same time, but in different parts. They have to all go day by day. That was a structure that at first I was really nervous about, and to be honest, when I first started this book, especially in day like 1 and 2, it crossed my mind at some point that this might be the worst Stormlight Archive book. That thought did come through my head, I'm just gonna be honest, because a couple reasons. One, the pacing is very different from previous books. We really have to build the tension of the story rather than having like a really big kind of climax here and a really big climax here spread out through the parts. It's very much all of these characters being in their own separate stories, having to build up to the final confrontation. So the first part of the story is quite a bit slower than the rest of the series in my personal opinion. However, I was definitely won over by that because it really does do a great job of building that tension. That's one thing I'll say that Sanderson did very well in this story. While it did start slow, there was very much this ticking time bomb sort of feeling to the story, and as we got through the days, the characters had less time to figure out what the heck they were going to do, and so there was a lot of very well-built tension. And in addition to that, because of the chronological nature of this story, we got to really see the growth and development of these characters through the 10 days of the story. And that's why, like, ultimately, I totally bought into the structure of the story. I actually really ended up enjoying it, and I felt like it was the change of pace that the book called for ultimately. Regardless of the 10-day structure, I think that build up to the final climax really fit the tone of this story, and I really did end up enjoying it quite a lot. So like I said though, I am going to touch on a couple plot things. So if you don't know, the Stormlight Archive is told in a way where each book has the present day plot line, but there's also flashbacks from one character's point of view in each book. In the past, those have been Kaladin in book 1, Shallan in book 2, Dalinar in book 3, Venli in book 4, and now in book 5 we have Szeth Sun Vallana, who is a very interesting character who was introduced right away at the very beginning of Stormlight. And I am so happy to say that the flashback sections in this book were my favorite of the entire series. I was so curious to find out about Szeth's story and how he got to where he is at the start of the Stormlight Archive series, and my goodness, the world building, the payoff, the emotional moments, it just completely worked for me. This is definitely the best of the flashback scenes in all of the books. As far as the other 4 characters go, I had some good things and some not so good things about this story, because ultimately, it's really hard to balance so many characters, because in Stormlight, not only are there just so many characters, there's so many main characters. This is really an ensemble story, and so inevitably, of those 5 characters, one of them, in particular, really doesn't have a lot to do in this story, and kind of shows up about halfway through, to be honest, and I'm like, oh yeah, this person's a character. Cool. And that's kind of how I felt about their story throughout the entire book, which was a little bit upsetting because I, in the past, have enjoyed their arc quite a bit. They definitely did add some stuff to the plot, but like I said, Sanderson had to make some sacrifices to the story at some point, because you can't just have so much. I mean, this would have been like a 2,000-page book if he did every idea he possibly had for each of the characters, I imagine. And so if there was a character that was going to be cut a little bit from the story, it makes sense that it was this character. But just have that in mind, that all of the characters from the 5 books are going to be featured in this story, but some of them will have more to do than others. There was also one character's story arc in particular that I was really nervous about going in. It was a character who I had certain expectations of where their story was going to go, and really in Rhythm of War, those expectations kind of started to go by the wayside, and in this book, Wind and Truth, it absolutely was different than what I ever expected it to be. And that was something that at first, to be honest, I was a little bit nervous about, and I wasn't sure I was going to enjoy. But I have to learn to trust Brandon Sanderson, because he really does know what he's doing with his character arcs, with his plot payoffs, with everything. And honestly, I can say I didn't expect this, but at the same time, the entire book of Rhythm of War was set up for where this character is going in Wind and Truth, so it definitely made sense overall. I just had certain expectations that Brandon Sanderson subverted magnificently, and I ended up buying into it completely, so great job, Brando Sando, you did it. We also have to talk about whether or not this book is what it claims to be. So I was very curious going into this, because in some ways it's a finale in that it's the end of the first arc of the Stormlight Archive series, but it's not the end of the series as a whole. It's going to be 10 books. So I had a lot of questions of, is this going to feel like a last book? Is it going to feel like a middle book? And the answer to that question is yes. It feels like both of those things in a way that I really enjoyed. It definitely feels like an ending to quite a few different plot lines and character arcs in this story. And I think that those endings were done perfectly. I think Brandon Sanderson absolutely pulled off all of the endings he was trying to do. Those that were beautiful, those that were heartbreaking, those that were full of sacrifice, those that were full of satisfaction. He really had a lot of endings that did take place in this story, and I think each of them was set up so magnificently over the course of the series. They made sense, but at the same time, there were moments in this story and the execution of the final moments that took my breath away, because I had no idea that that was going to happen. But when he did the things he did, it made perfect sense to me. And so yes, it does feel like a finale, but at the same time, there are so many things that are going on in Roshar right now that are just beginning. It's not like, oh, it could be spun off, to be another series or whatever. This is the midway point of the series very clearly. Some things happen at the end of Wind and Truth that set up some huge stakes for the future of the Cosmere and the future of Roshar specifically. And I've never been so excited to get my hands on more Stormlight, which is unfortunate because we've got probably 10 years until book 6 comes out. But that gives you time to catch up if you haven't already. I do have a couple of gripes with Wind and Truth that I do want to get out of the way and kind of let you know about. So first of all, Brandon Sanderson's writing is not something that ever bothers me, though some people have gripes about his prose. I think it's incredibly readable and is very specific to the story he's trying to tell, so I'm fine with that. That being said, there were a couple specifically real world terms that were used in this story that I understand why they were used, because there are what are called world hoppers in the Cosmere that kind of flow in and out of different worlds, and that's the whole point of the multiverse is they go to this world, they go to that world, and that kind of bleeds over into Roshar, bringing different ideas and things to this world. So I guess it makes sense that that term or certain terms would be used in this story. However, I couldn't help but wish that there was more of like an in-world version of it, like the same way that he does like, oh, storming instead of like different curse words or whatever. Why couldn't he have in-world terms for the things that take place in this book? Because it did take me out of it a little bit in the story, but ultimately I was able to get past that and enjoy the meaning behind it rather than fixating so much on the word specifically. But that is something that bothered me. And then additionally, there were a couple moments in the story that, yes, had huge payoff and made a lot of sense, but I had to ask myself, okay, if this accidental thing hadn't happened, what would this character's decision or plan have been in these circumstances, both from the hero's point of view and the villain's point of view? I had questions on, okay, are we relying a little bit too heavily on chance in this moment or not? So a couple gripes here and there, but you guys, this book was amazing. I feel like I need to say that. I've talked a lot about a lot of different things about how I felt about it, but Wind and Truth is everything I wanted it to be and more, and things that I thought I wasn't gonna like, but I ultimately ended up loving. This book just pulled it off. Like, I think that this was really a make it or break it moment for Brandon Sanderson's career. He's had endings before, particularly like The Hero of Ages, which is a little bit divisive. And then there's this book now that is truly a climax for the series. And so I think for this, it was kind of a moment of, okay, readers who maybe have been waiting to get into the series, is this going to make or break their decision to read this series? And I'm here to tell you, Wind and Truth is absolutely worth the journey to get to this destination. It is one of the best books I've ever read, easily one of the best fantasy books I've ever read, possibly my favorite fantasy book I've ever read. And it is probably, I need to sit with it a little bit longer, my favorite Stormlight Archive book. But honestly, it's the Sanderlanche, the huge epic finale of this book. The last like 200 pages is unbelievable. It felt like whiplash because there were so many POVs and each of them were reaching these huge moments back to back to back, and so much was happening. But Brandon Sanderson juggled those things with incredible grace and incredible talent. Like, the fact that this man was able to write this book is wild. And I'm blown away by this story. There were emotional moments that really got to me. There were fantastic moments that had me cheering. There was definitely a little bit of fan service, but I was totally on board with it. And ultimately, I think that this book fulfills the promises that it made in being both a finale and the middle point of this larger series. I think that Brandon Sanderson deserves his spot as one of the most famous fantasy writers of all time. The Stormlight Archive deserves its spot as one of the best series of all time, and it is absolutely worth the commitment to reading. Have you read Wind and Truth or started the Stormlight Archive at all? If you have, how far into it are you, and are you loving it as much as I did? For me personally, Wind and Truth was a 5 out of 5 stars. I loved it so much. I'm still in awe of what this book did, and I will maybe at some point do a spoiler-filled video just to get all my thoughts out there, but to be honest, I'm still processing this. This is a 1,300-page book that I finished in less than a week, so yeah, I'm exhausted. I'm gonna go take a nap, but thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Like I said, I would love it if you liked and subscribed if you haven't already, and yeah, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.